The loading icon had been spinning for 4 minutes. I had counted 3 brains, all counting, all arriving at the same number, which meant the terminal was genuinely stuck and not simply being slow, which meant I was genuinely close to reaching through the screen and rearranging whatever components were responsible for this performance. My name is S7X7. My classmates call me Save. I'm a third cycle student at the Galactic Institute of Civilization Studies. I carry a clean academic record across 11 consecutive terms, and right now I am being defeated by a small spinning circle on a research terminal. The file I needed was not large. It was a standard archive pull from the Interstellar History Repository Catalog, number IHR 7741. Subject Terran exclusion from the Galactic Valky War, cycles 1088 through 1094. Professor Alindra had given the assignment 3 days ago, 6 weeks to research one group paper. At the end, the class had formed its conclusion within approximately 40 seconds of the assignment being announced. Humans were kept out of the war because they were too fragile, too new as a spacefaring species. The Galactic Council, in its widely celebrated wisdom, had protected the young newcomers from a conflict beyond their capability, while the established powers handled the actual work. Open and shut. I had already written 3/4 of the paper in my head before I sat down. The loading circle kept spinning. I cataloged 17 different ways to describe my feelings about this and filed all 17 under irrelevant. Proceed. Across the research table, Hicks was working through a bag of crunch worms that had been completely full when we arrived and was now roughly half empty. Hicks is cruel, which means Hicks is approximately 2 m of layered carapace, and what I can only describe as anticipatory catastrophizing. Hicks had predicted in the first 12 minutes of our session that the archive system would crash before we finished, that Professor Alindra had designed the assignment as a secret evaluation of our group dynamics, and that the crunch worms were slightly stale. I had not commented on any of these predictions. 2 of them were going to turn out to be correct, but in no way Hicks had imagined. Durry was sitting across from me with both resonance chambers fully extended and open, which in a palace indicates contentment bordering on enthusiasm. Durry processes the world as layered sound and communicates in harmonic sequences that require a secondary translation unit to follow in real time. They are also, I should note, a genuinely excellent researcher when they are not annotating their source documents in frequencies that only 3 species on campus can hear. Their last methodology paper had footnotes that vibrated. Professor Alindra had given it full marks and an accompanying note suggesting standard text notation for all future submissions. And then there was Yenna. Yenna was the human in our group. Professor Alindra had assigned her to our team at the start of semester, and I had analyzed this decision as either a deliberate pedagogical choice designed to add cross-species perspective to our research, or a small act of chaos from a professor who had been teaching long enough to find chaos genuinely interesting. I had not yet resolved the question. Yenna was an exchange student, 3rd year, studying galactic political history with a specific focus on post-war reconstruction periods. She brought her own coffee to every session. In a dark ceramic cup, she smiled frequently and with apparent ease. I had Logged this smile on day 1 under. Statistically suspicious pending closer. Review, I had not found time to revisit. The file. She was smiling now. I turned back to my terminal. The loading circle stopped. The files opened. I began with standard documentation. Council session records, pre-war threat. Assessment, mobilization reports from every allied species. Everything was organized, everything was where the index said it would be. I cross-referenced the timeline, pulled casualty projections, noted the early phases of Volkai aggression, and worked my way through 2 subdirectories before I reached the human exclusion file. I expected fragility assessments, capability scores, a diplomatic mem from some council representative explaining with appropriate gentleness why the human species was not yet ready for the reality of interstellar warfare. The file loaded. The first line was a classification. Header: Existential Class Asset, restricted by Council Order 7 Alpha. I stared at the screen. I read it again slowly. I read the specific word combination, existential class asset, which is not what you write. Above, documentation explaining that species is too fragile to participate in a war. I took those 3 words and tried every logical arrangement that would produce the conclusion everyone in my class had reached in 40 seconds. None of them worked. I refiled this under archival error. Surely. I pulled the index for Council Order 7 Alpha. The index was also restricted. The cross-reference files were sealed. The pre-war simulation logs, which should have been standard, declassified. Material available to any level 4 archive user were sitting behind the same classification wall. The seal timestamp showed they had been locked in cycle 1087. 1 full year before the war began. Someone had decided 1 year before the war that whatever was in those simulations needed to be classified at the highest protection tier in the Galactic record. I sat with that for a moment. Hicks looked over from across the table. Find anything useful? Not yet, I said. This was technically accurate. I had found nothing I could open, but I had found the outline of a wall, and a wall that large built that specifically in that location tells you things about its contents even when you cannot see inside it. I glanced at Yana. She was reading. She had a document open on her screen, and she was positioned on what appeared to be the same page she had occupied for the past 30 minutes. But she was not reading slowly. I had watched enough researchers work to know what slow reading looks like and what holding a specific page looks like, and Yana was doing the second one. She had opened to a particular location and stayed there with the patience of someone waiting for something to catch up to them. She had not looked at my screen, but when I glanced at her, there was no question in her posture, no lean of curiosity toward what I had found. She held herself with the particular stillness of someone who already knows the shape of the room they are sitting in. My third brain, which is the quietest of the 3 and by far the most inconvenient, noted this without comment and added it to a folder it had been building since day 1 of the semester. I worked around the wall. I pulled everything accessible, standard war records, strategic timelines, species, contribution data. The Volkai had been a genuine threat, technically superior in raw firepower, and they had nearly broken the Council's eastern defense. Network in the first 8 months before the counteroffensive was organized. The war had ultimately cost somewhere between 11 and 14 million lives, depending on which methodology you used. To calculate the numbers, my clutch sibling was inside one of those counts. Marin Corridor, 3rd year, a standard engagement that lasted 6 days and produced 11,000 casualties before the front moved on. I keep that number in a drawer. I keep the drawer closed. I pulled more files. An hour and 40 minutes into the session, I found the human enrollment records. These were not classified, no headers, no walls, no restriction codes. They were sitting in open archive, accessible at level 2, and they appear to have received very little traffic in recent academic years. Human military enrollment requests, cycles 1088 through 1092. Not a small number of requests, thousands of individual applications, formal petitions submitted by planetary human governments, official integration, inquiries from multiple human military organizations requesting assignment, pathways into the Council Warfleet, all of them denied, every single one across 4 consecutive years. I scrolled through the denial records. The timestamps march forward year by year in steady, unbroken sequence. Year 1 of the war, year 2, year 3, year 4. I found documented cases in the records of humans attempting to board Council warships at 3 separate deep space stations. They had not been hostile. They had not forced entry. They had arrived and stated, in various terms, that they wanted to assist. They wanted assignment. They wanted to contribute to a war that was taking lives on every side. All turned back every time under Council Order 7 Alpha. I put the records side by side. Official story: humans kept out of the war to protect them, young species, fragile, not ready. What I was looking at: 4 years of humans trying to get into a war they were supposedly being sheltered from, being turned away each time by an order, classified at existential level, and sealed a year before the first shot was fired. These were not the same story. I looked at Yana. She was still on her page. Her coffee was still steaming. We had been in this room for 2 hours. By any reasonable thermal calculation, that cup should have been cold for the past 90 minutes. I added the coffee to my anomalies log. My anomalies log was getting longer than I had planned. I said, Dari Hicks, our paper just became significantly more complicated. Hicks predicted the archive would crash. Dari's resonance chambers closed halfway and emitted a sound that the translation unit rendered as something important is present. Yana looked up from her page. Her expression was attentive and patient and carried no trace of surprise. What did you find? She asked. A wall, I said. A very large wall, built in a very specific location, and 4 years of humans trying to get through it. She nodded once, small and even. Good, she said, keep going. That was the moment I reclassified this assignment from open and shut to something I was not prepared for. The next session began earlier than scheduled. I arrived at the archive room before anyone else. I had been awake for most of the night, running the same sequence of facts through my 3 brains in rotation, and all 3 had arrived at the same unsatisfied conclusion. What I had found did not fit any version of the official record that I had spent 11 academic terms internalizing, and I Needed more data before I could begin to understand why. I had 12 new files pulled by the time Hicks arrived. Hicks came in, observed that the room was too cold, sat down, and opened the crunch worm bag. I noted that this was a new bag, which meant Hicks had stopped on the way here. I did not comment. Crunch worms are a standard cruel stress response, and Hicks had plenty of material to work with. Durry arrived with what appeared to be a full meal and both resonance chambers already open. This was unusual. Durry rarely ate during research sessions, whatever frequency yesterday's material had produced in. Their internal processing had apparently kept them occupied overnight, and they were arriving with full energy reserves, and what I could only interpret as determination. Yina was last. She came in with her coffee. She sat in the same chair she had occupied yesterday. She looked at my screen and said, "You pulled the enrollment records last night again, didn't you?" It was not a question. I was confirming the numbers, I said. "They are accurate," she said. "I know," I said. "I confirmed them." She smiled. It was the same smile I had logged on day one. I moved it from pending review to significant requires direct investigation. I told the group what I had found. The enrollment records, 4 years of applications, formal petitions, station appearances, all denied, all filed under the same sealed order. Hicks catastrophized briefly and then became very still, which is the cruel equivalent of serious engagement. Durry hummed something the translation unit could not process, which meant it was either too complex or too emotional for standard parameters. When I finished, Yana set her cup down and said, "The simulation files are the next step. They are classified existential class." I said, "Level 4 access does not reach them." She said, "Not directly, but there are categories within the simulation archive. The main runs are sealed, but the pre-run index files are classified differently, restricted pending review. Under Level 4, we can file a temporary declassification window request." I looked at her. "That is a precise knowledge of archival access law," I said. "I studied the access levels before the semester started," she said. "For this project specifically, there was a meaningful difference between those two things, and the meaningful difference was sitting in a folder in my third brain that was now getting quite full." I set it aside and submitted the declassification request. The system approved it in 11 seconds. Hicks said this was suspicious. I noted the 11 seconds in my log and opened the first file. Pre-war strategic modeling had been standard council practice across centuries of interstellar governance. Every significant conflict in recorded galactic history had been run through the simulation system before or during its actual occurrence. The models were extraordinarily accurate, calibrated over generations, refined with each use, trusted by every military and political authority in the Alliance. When the model gave you a number, you used it. Everyone used it. The first simulation I opened was labeled Standard Conflict Scenario A1. Volkai aggression versus full council. Allied forces. Standard unit. Compositions, standard deployment. Strategies, standard resource. Allocation, the models projected. Conflict duration, 72 months. The actual conflict duration, 72 months. Within a 3-month margin over 6 years. The model had been right. I noted this in my research log. When a model is that accurate over that long a period, you are not looking at statistics anymore. You are looking at something that has earned the trust of millions of lives and has not failed them. I opened the next file. Standard conflict scenario A2, same parameters as A1, one variable changed. Human military units integrated into the Council Allied fleet at the start of the conflict. Projected conflict duration, 11 months. I sat very still. I read it again. The same model that had predicted the actual 6-year war to within 3 months was projecting a conflict of 11 months with a single variable added. I looked at Hicks. Hicks looked at the screen. Neither of us said anything. 11 months. There is an error in the integration parameters, I said. The model does not have sufficient human combat data from this era to calibrate accurately. Durry said very quietly, open the next. 1. Standard conflict scenario A3, human units integrated at the midpoint of the conflict rather than the start. Projected duration from the integration. 19 months. Not 11 months, the later integration. Extended the timeline. But 19 months from the midpoint of a 6-year war meant the total conflict would have been roughly 37 months, still barely more than half the actual duration. Hicks had stopped eating crunch worms. I pulled A4, humans as support units. Only no frontline placement, 16 months. Total A5, human units confined to limited deployment zones, 14 months. A6, a single human battalion attached to the Eastern Defense Line, the line that had nearly broken in the first 8 months of the actual war. The Eastern Line held, the Valky never breached the interior, the simulation reached completion in 22 months. I stopped opening files for a moment. The room was very quiet. Durry's chambers were nearly closed. Hicks had put the crunch worm bag on the far side of the table away from easy reach, which is a thing Hicks does when something has become too large for crunch worms to address. There are more scenarios, I said. There are, Yina said. Her voice was even careful. How many more? I found the full index while you were reading, she said. 312 separate simulation runs, all variations of human integration, different timing, different unit types, different command structures. I looked at her. You searched the full index. I have been running a parallel search since we arrived this morning, she said. I found something in a secondary subfolder, not simulation files. Something different. She turned her screen around. 3 documents, internal council, communications, high-level signatories. Dates from cycle 1087. The year before the war. The subject heading on the first document was the Terran question. I read it slowly. The document referenced the simulations. It cited the numbers. It used the careful, structured language of powerful institutions when they are discussing something that makes them deeply uncomfortable and needed not to look that way. Formal phrasing, passive constructions, terms that create distance between the reader and the weight of the content. The document did not use the word fragile. It did not use the word protection. It used words like unpredictable, like outcomes exceeding defined conflict, parameters like variables that resist, standard calibration like escalatory, trajectory with insufficient upper Boundary. I read that last phrase 3 times. Escalatory trajectory with insufficient. Upper boundary. Not too weak to fight. Not needs to be protected. I looked up from the screen. I looked at Yenna. She was looking at the document. Her hands were around her coffee cup in the way that people hold warm things when the temperature of everything around them drops. They were not worried about humans getting hurt, I said. Nobody in the room disagreed. Nobody in the room said anything at all. The third document in Yenna's subfolder was a single-page follow-up. Communication, shorter than the others. The subject was Terran enrollment. Requests year 2. The body of the message was 3 sentences. The enrollment requests continued at the same volume as the previous year. Denial policy was maintained. The council recommended maintaining the official narrative. Protection protocol. Official narrative. Not policy, not actual reasoning. Narrative. Someone had seen the simulation results. Someone had decided on a different story to tell. Someone had used that story for the full 6 years the war continued, while the actual contents of those files sat behind classification walls and gathered nothing. Hicks made a sound. I knew the sound. Crew will have a range of non-verbal communications that are very specific about emotional states. This one meant I have just encountered information that requires me to reclassify something I have held as settled fact, and the reclassification is causing damage. I understood the sound completely. The war had lasted 6 years. The model had said 11 months. Every month that lived between those two numbers was a specific individual cost, paid by specific individual people, across every species in the Alliance, including Hicks's family, including mine. I kept the arithmetic from running by, focusing on the screen, and the screen kept running the arithmetic anyway. Before you decide what this means, Yana said quietly, you need to see the rest. There is one more simulation in the index. It was run separately from the others. Different label, different classification tier. Show me, I said. She did. We stayed in the archive room past the scheduled session end. Nobody suggested leaving. The bag of crunchworms was empty. Dari's chambers were fully closed, which I had never seen before. And GT snorts. And GT. The overhead lights had shifted to the cooler night setting that the building ran automatically after a certain hour. And none of us had noticed it happen. I had been looking at the same number for 40 minutes. 6 weeks. The file was labeled Special Assessment. Autonomous Human Command. It was the last in the index, run separately from the 312 standard scenarios. The parameters were different from all previous runs. In every prior simulation, human units had been integrated into the Council command structure. They operated within the Alliance hierarchy, received orders through standard channels, required Council strategic approval for major tactical decisions. In this scenario, the humans had their own command, their own strategy. No Council approval required, no oversight. Layer fully autonomous operation. 6 weeks. Not months. 6 weeks for a war that had lasted 6 years and had taken 11 to 14 million lives depending on the methodology, and the methodology was a way of not thinking about what 11 million means when you make it an individual number in A row of individuals. I looked at the screen until the number stopped being abstract. It did not stop. Hicks was very still. Dari had ceased. All sound entirely. Yena was looking at her cup. I scrolled past the projected duration into the methodology notes at the bottom of the file. This was unusual. Standard simulation outputs do not include commentary from the modeling team. The model produces numbers in separate. Analysts interpret them in separate documents, but here someone had written directly into the assessment. Technical note, precise and careful, which made it more disturbing than dramatic language would have been. The note said, the standard Valky deterrent strategy of withdrawal. Regroup offer terms does not produce expected outcomes when applied against autonomous human command units. Repeated application of this deterrent produces no behavioral modification in human tactical response. Human units receive offered terms, transmit them through their internal command chain, await strategic decision, and continue operational activity during the decision window. The deterrence mechanism assumes a pause in hostilities during negotiation. No such pause occurs. I read it twice. Humans did not stop fighting while they were deciding whether to accept peace. The model continued, no species in the existing historical record exhibits this specific behavioral pattern at scale. Parameters in this assessment are set to conservative estimates. Actual outcomes in a real deployment scenario may be more significant than projected, more significant than 6 weeks. I put the document down on the virtual surface and did not pick it up again for several minutes. The room was the quietest room I had been in since I could remember. Hicks said very low, 6 weeks. Nobody answered. Hicks said, the war went 6 years. Still nobody answered. Your people tried to enlist for 4 years, Hicks said, looking at Yena. They showed up at the stations, they filed the papers, they tried every official channel that existed. In all that time, the simulation was sitting in the archive saying 6 weeks. Yena did not look away. Yes, she said. Did they know, Hicks asked, the ones who showed up, the ones who tried? They know what the simulation said. Yena was quiet for a moment. Some of them suspected, she said, not the specific numbers but the shape of the reason for the denial. Some of them were not really filing enrollment requests. They were asking a question. That was their way of asking, is there something you are not telling us? Is the official story the real story? And nobody answered them, Hicks said. No, Yena said, nobody answered them. I've been keeping the arithmetic back by focusing on the technical details of the file. I could not keep it back anymore. My clutch sibling was in the 3rd year of that 6-year war. The Marin corridor engagement lasted 6 days. If the council had made a different decision in cycle 1087, the Marin corridor engagement might not have happened. It is not possible to know exactly which days fall inside the window between 11 months and 72 months. It is not possible to know precisely which casualties belong in that window. It is also not possible to stop doing the calculation once you have started it. I kept my voice level. There is more. I said there has to be. The council saw these results. They had 7 alpha drafted and signed before the war started. That decision was documented. Where is the documentation? Dari opened one resonance chamber and said, I have been searching a parallel directory since this afternoon. I found an access point 20 minutes ago. I was waiting for the right moment to show you. We all looked at Durry. A subsidiary policy brief, Durry said, turning their screen, not the main order but cross-reference to it. Classification level 3 within our access range. The document was titled Implementation Framework for Terran Engagement. Limitation, Cycle 1087. Internal use only. I opened it. 8 pages, standard government format. The language of institutions making significant decisions in the vocabulary of administration. Page 2 contained the simulation summary, the numbers I had seen, all of them laid out plainly. Page 3 contained what the Council called post-conflict risk analysis. Residual tactical momentum, species-wide. Operational escalation risk, ongoing. Engagement likelihood extending beyond. Defined conflict parameters. I read that last phrase carefully. Not humans might be hard to control during the conflict. Beyond the defined conflict parameters. After page 5 was the decision record. The Council had voted 17 to 15. 2 votes. 2 votes had determined that the war would last 6 years instead of 11 months. The stated reason for public use: protection of a developing species. The actual reason, written herein: internal documentation. Simulation results indicate that human military participation at any integration level produces outcomes falling outside the Council's post-conflict recovery and stabilization framework. The Council's responsibility includes not only resolution of the current conflict but maintenance of stable multi-species conditions in the post-conflict period. Based on all available evidence, it is not possible to include human military participation while also maintaining those conditions. I set down the document. They were not protecting humans, I said. No, Yenna said. They were protecting everything that came after. Yes, she said. The room held that for a moment. Then Hicks said, was there a human representative in those sessions? Did a human see this decision being made? I turned to the next page. Section 7, the signature page. 32 Council representatives, every major spacefaring species. And below them, one additional signature. Ambassador Clara Voss, Terran. Interstellar Diplomatic Corps, Cycle 1087. A human had signed it. A human had been in those sessions, had read the simulation data, had seen the vote, and had added her name to the order that would deny thousands of her own people's enrollment requests for 4 consecutive years. Below her signature, a handwritten note. The translation was in the documents. Footnote. It read, we have been shown what we are. When we are given no limits, I do not believe we are only that, but I understand why you cannot take the risk. Without our agreement, you have it. 12 lines. No additional explanation. No defense of the decision, no argument for its moral weight, no appeal for recognition of the cost she was agreeing to accept. Just you have it. I sat with those 12 lines for a long time. Hicks said she agreed. Yes, I said. She read the simulations and agreed. Yes. She went home, Hicks said slowly, and she told her government no, and the official story was fragile species protection protocol, and humans came to the docking stations year after year, asking to be let in. And she had signed the order that kept turning them away. And she knew why, and they did not. Yina was looking at the translation of the handwritten note. Her expression was the kind that people develop over a long time of carrying something they did not choose to put down. She did not tell them the full reason. I said she could not, the order was classified. But she agreed with the reason. Yina said that is the important part. She was not forced, she was shown the data. She considered it and she agreed. She thought the council was right, I said. She thought they were right about what the simulation showed, Yina said carefully, and she thought that was reason enough to sign. I looked at the 12 lines again. I do not believe we are only that. She had not told the council they were wrong about the data. She had told them, this is accurate and I agree it is a reason and you have my consent. She had believed the simulation and she had chosen on behalf of her entire species to say, not here. The terminal clock showed it was nearly midnight. Nobody moved to leave. We found the main order in the morning. Not through any sophisticated legal maneuver, through a filing backlog. Physical to digital conversion queue in an older archive format processing documents from the original classified era. The file had been waiting in the queue for decades. Nobody had specifically sealed the conversion copy because it had not yet finished being digital when the current classification system was implemented and the original sealing notation had not transferred cleanly to the pending format. A gap in the paperwork, a decades old technicality. Dari found it. Dari had been in the archive room before any of us arrived. Both chambers fully open, running on whatever Palissy metabolize in place of sleep. When I walked in, Dari was looking at a secondary terminal with an expression I had never seen on a Palissy face before. The closest translation my unit could manage was, something is present here that I was not fully prepared to encounter. You found it, I said. Part of it, Dari said, 38 pages. I've been reading for 2 hours. Hicks was already there, very still. Yenna was in the corner with her coffee. And she looked up when I entered and nodded once. Her expression was the same. It always was, patient, carrying something steady under its weight. I sat down and began reading. Council Order 7 Alpha, issued Cycle 1087. 32 primary signatories. The preamble was the standard language of Galactic governance, careful and bloodless, the kind of prose designed to make terrible things sound like careful planning. I moved past it quickly. The order opened with the simulation data, all of it plainly stated, no editorializing. The snorts numbers existed and the order did not pretend they were something other than what they were. Then it moved into material I had not seen before. Section 3 was a detailed breakdown of specific behavioral variables the model could not adequately calibrate and why. The Council's analysts had spent significant time studying human military history to understand the mechanism behind the simulation results, because understanding it was necessary before they could decide whether the results were accurate or produced by a model that lacked sufficient data. The analysts concluded the model was not wrong. They had studied human conflict history, the full record which spans tens of thousands of years before the species achieved space flight and is by any measurement the longest continuous conflict record of any spacefaring species in the galactic archive. The analysts noted that a history of internal conflict was not unique among spacefaring species. Many had arrived at the galactic stage with complicated histories of violence. What was different about the human record was not the frequency or scale of conflict in isolation. It was the mechanism. Most species fight until one side withdraws, one side reaches a threshold, assesses the cost and steps back. This creates the opening for negotiation. This is how wars end, not because one side is destroyed, but because one side recalculates, and the recalculation produces a willingness to discuss terms. Every conflict resolution framework in the galactic record is built around this mechanism. Every deterrent strategy, every peacekeeping protocol, every post-war settlement structure assumes that at some point both sides chose to stop. Analysts finding humans negotiate. Their diplomatic record is extensive and sophisticated, and they use it effectively across every domain of interstellar relations. But when they choose to fight, the part of their structure responsible for fighting does not hold itself in reserve for negotiation. It continues. The diplomatic function and the military function do not run simultaneously. They run separately in sequence, and the sequence does not cross while the military function is active. Other species maintain partial activity in both simultaneously. One arm extends an offer while the other continues pressure. It is the standard model of conflict resolution. Humans complete the military task before opening the second channel fully. The analysts could not find a single recorded exception in tens of thousands of years of human conflict history. I read that section 3 times. My second brain, which handles comparative analysis, spent approximately 4 minutes reclassifying the entire galactic political history section of its storage. The war that had actually happened was shaped in large part by the standard conflict resolution model. The VAR had used ceasefire periods to regroup. The Council had accepted this because the framework required it. Because you do not resolve a conflict without the negotiation phase, and the negotiation phase requires pauses. The Council had known the VAR were using the pauses tactically and had accepted it anyway. The simulation showed what happened when the pause did not exist. I moved to Section 5, the deliberation record, not the summary. The full session notes. One council representative, a Veth elder, named Arison, had argued against the exclusion across multiple sessions. The record showed it was a long argument and a thorough one. Arison's position: humanity has a right to participate in the defense of the galactic community. The simulations show they would end the conflict in a fraction of the time. Fewer total lives lost across the full conflict. The post-conflict risks are real, but they are projections from a model that the analysts themselves admit lacks sufficient historical data for human behavior in this specific context. We do not have the moral right to extend the actual war by years based on projected risks about a conflict that may not occur. The counterargument came from the Drenali representative, 2 paragraphs. No extended argument. The Drenali said the post-conflict projections are not speculative, they are the direct mathematical consequence of the same mechanism that ends the war. In 6 weeks, a species that does not stop partially cannot stop partially. The residual trajectory after the conflict resolves is not a risk we assess from limited data. It is the continued operation of the same variable that resolves the conflict. The question before this council is not whether to involve humanity in the current war. The question is whether we can define where the current war ends if they are part of ending it. 17 to 15. 2 votes. I looked up from the document. Hicks was looking at the table. Durry had both chambers closed for the first time in my experience of knowing Durry. Yena was reading quietly with her hand wrapped around her cup. I thought about Irison's argument. Fewer total lives, the post-conflict risks our projections. I thought about the Drenals too. Paragraphs. We cannot define where the current war ends. I thought about my clutch sibling in the 3rd year, the Marin Corridor, 11,000. In 6 days. I thought about where that engagement falls in the distance between 11 months and 72 months. I found Clara Vass's signature again. I read the 12 lines again. We have been shown what we are when we are given no limits. I do not believe we are only that. She had read Irison's argument. She had read the Drenals' 2 paragraphs. She had seen the numbers. She had sat in those sessions and she had looked at the simulation results and she had considered the question of which cost was tolerable. And she had signed. Not forced, not deceived, she had agreed. I said there were humans who showed up at the stations anyway, thousands of them for 4 years, some of them suspected the real reason. You said they were asking, but some of them simply wanted to help and had no idea. Yana looked up. Yes, she said. Clara Vass knew both groups existed. She knew some of them suspected and were being denied without an honest answer. She signed an order that protected the classification. She agreed to the narrative. Yana was quiet for a moment. She agreed to the narrative because the alternative was explaining the real reason. Yana said, and the real reason is what you just read in section 3. I understood what she meant. You do not tell your people, we are keeping you out of this war because your own council representative agreed with the simulation that showed you would not stop when the war was finished. You cannot tell people that. So you tell them protection protocol. Fragile species not ready. And you carry the other version by yourself, along with the people who were trusted enough to be in the room when the vote happened. Did she have children? I asked. Yana looked at me. I do not know, she said. If she did, I said, they grew up with the official story, protection protocol. Young species needs to be kept safe. And they would never have known that. Their parents signed the real order. Yana did not answer. The room held that question without resolving it. 3 days later, I requested a meeting with Professor Alindra. She called me into her office the next morning. Alindra has been teaching galactic history for longer than most of the government she teaches about of existed. Her office reflects this. It is organized with the specific chaos of someone who stopped trying to impress other people with their filing system several decades ago. There are things in that room from 100 different worlds in time, periods sitting in arrangements that make sense only to the person who put them there. She looked at me when I walked in and said, "You found the archive." I said, "You knew what we would find." "I assigned it," she said. She gestured at the chair across from her desk. I sat down. "Level 4 access," I said. "You gave our group level 4 specifically for this project. Standard student access is level 2. Level 4 is the access tier that reaches the simulation index, declassification window, and the pre-war communication files." "Yes," she said. "And you assigned a human student to our group, a third year specializing in post-war reconstruction who had clearly studied the specific access laws relevant to this archive before the semester began. Yena is the best research student in her year," Alindra said. "It seemed appropriate. You could have assigned any human student. You chose one who already knew the shape of what we would find." Alindra was quiet for a moment. She picked up something from her desk, a small object I did not recognize, turned it in her hands once, and set it down. "The assignment stands," she said. "Paper is due in 3 weeks. Write what you found." I looked at her. "Did you lose anyone in the war?" The room was quiet. "My research partner," she said. "Cycle 1091. She said it in the same voice she used for everything, which was calm and complete and closed, the way you say something that you have said enough times over enough years that it has become a fact rather than a wound. Write the paper, save, write the honest version." I left her office and went back to the group. We had one more session. We used all of it. Not for new research. The research was finished. We used the session to sit with the full shape of what we had found and work through it from every direction, because some things need to be carried through more than one mind before they settle into their right weight. The shape of the thing we had found was this. The Galactic Council had run 312 simulations plus one autonomous command assessment. Every scenario produced the same category of result. A human representative had been present for the deliberations. She had read the numbers, considered the arguments on both sides, and signed the order that excluded her species from the conflict. The official narrative had been built to protect the classification and to prevent a secondary conflict that the honest explanation might produce. The war had lasted 6 years, 11 to 14 million lives. My clutch sibling, Hicks's family, Dura's home world, which had been in a contested system for 2 full years of the conflict, all of it paid. On the other side of the ledger, 6 weeks, whatever the model projected, lay on the other side of 6 weeks if no limit existed. Both costs were real. The question of which one was right to pay had no clean answer. It still did not. I had spent 4 days looking for one, and the looking had produced nothing but a clearer picture of the question itself. What Clara Vass had decided was not that one cost was acceptable and the other was not. She had decided that she agreed with the Council's reasoning and that her agreement was the only thing that made the decision legitimate, and that she owed the Council that agreement if their reasoning was sound. Whether the reasoning was sound was the question we had been sitting with for 3 days. I asked Yena, "How does your species teach this in your schools, in your diplomatic training? Is there a standard position on whether she was right?" Yena considered this carefully. "There is a standard account," she said. a version that is taught as history. It covers the basic facts. Ambassador Vass attended the council deliberations. She reviewed the simulation data. She agreed with the exclusion decision and signed the order. The war proceeded as documented. The official narrative was maintained until partial declassification in the post-war period, and the standard position on whether she was right, I said. There is not one, Yina said. There are several. They have been arguing about it for generations, and they are still arguing. What is your position? I asked. She looked at me for a moment. I think she made the decision she was able to make with the information she had in the time she had it, Yina said. I think that is probably the most honest description of most of the important decisions anyone has ever made. And I think the question of whether it was right is not the most useful question to keep asking. What is the most useful question? I said. She looked at the cup in her hands. What do we do with what we know? She said. Not in the abstract. Specifically, we found the files. We have the numbers. We have the document. We have Clara Vass's 12 lines. What do we do with it? I thought about this. We write it down, I said. We file the paper in the open archive where anyone can read it. Yes, she said, that is a start. I asked about the coffee that evening. I had been meaning to ask for the entire semester, and I had kept finding larger anomalies to investigate first, but we were at the end now, and the coffee had been the first anomaly I logged, and I believed in closing open items. Your coffee, I said, same temperature every session for the full semester. This is not possible with a standard ceramic cup in a research archive that provides standard heated stands. Yina looked at the cup. Heating element in the ceramic, she said. I made it. There is a charge coil. At the base, it maintains temperature passively as long as there is liquid in the cup. Charge lasts about 8 hours. Power draw is very small. You built this, I said. Yes. Because, I said. She looked at me the way she sometimes did, patient and slightly amused and not unkind about it. Because I wanted my coffee to be hot, she said, and I did not want to depend on whether the archive room had a functioning heated stand available. I wanted that specific thing to be in my own hands. So I made something that meant I did not need anyone else to provide it. I looked at the cup. It was a modest piece of construction. And GT snorts. And GT, any engineering student could have met it in an afternoon with standard materials. It was not complicated. It was not impressive as a technical achievement. It was practical and specific, and slightly more work than the problem strictly required. She had made it because she wanted control over whether her coffee stayed warm. I thought about clairvoyance. I thought about a species with the longest internal conflict record in the Galactic archive and the most elaborate framework of laws and agreements and protocols built over centuries with the specific purpose of managing what that record revealed. I thought about the simulation and the 6 weeks and the deterrence variable that produced no pause. I thought about the 12-line note. I thought about what it means to look clearly at what you are capable of and build something that holds it in place. Not because the capability disappears, not because the simulation becomes inaccurate, but because you decide that what you do with what you are is a choice, and you have made the choice, and You are willing to pay the cost of it. Yina was holding a cup she had built herself because she did not want to depend on anyone else for warmth. A species that could have ended a 6-year war in 6 weeks had chosen instead to figure out how to keep their coffee hot through their own engineering. Both of those things were the same thing. I sat with that for a while. My 3 brains filed it in 3 different locations, and none of them were fully satisfied with where it landed because the right taxonomic category did not yet exist in my organizational system. I would need to build a new one. I walked home that night under a sky that was not my home sky, thinking about the cost of decisions made on behalf of people who were not in the room. The cost always lands somewhere. It always lands on specific individuals who carry it for specific years and then are asked to file it somewhere manageable. My clutch siblings' drawer was open. The arithmetic was running. The 17 to 15 votes sat in my second brain and would not stop mattering. But I was also carrying something else. Now, a species that looked at the model and signed the order not because they were weak or passive or uninvested in the outcome, because one representative looked at the simulation and at the 12 lines she was about to write and believed we should be capable of this choice. We should be able to look at what we are and decide not to be that here in this instance with these people, and came home and carried it and did not tell anyone the full reason, and watched her own people show up at the docking stations year after year, not knowing, just wanting to help, just wanting to stand beside their neighbors, and held the order. It is not a clean story. I have looked at it from every direction available to me, and it is not clean from any of them. The cost was real on every side. The reasoning was sound and insufficient. Simultaneously, Clara Vass was right, and she may have been wrong, and she knew she might be wrong, and she signed it anyway. That is, I think, what the 12 lines mean. Not, I am certain this is right. Not, I am sacrificing my people for the greater good with full moral confidence. We have been shown what we are when we are given no limits. I do not believe we are only that. You have my agreement. She believed they were not only the simulation. She was willing to pay the cost of that belief. So were 11 to 14 million people who were never told why. I submitted the group paper 3 weeks later. Professor Elindra called me back to her office after she read it. She looked at the document for a long moment, then looked at me. This is not the paper I expected from you, she said. No, I said. It is better. I'm not sure better is the word I would choose, I said. She looked at me. What word would you use? I thought about it. Honest, I said. It is more honest. She nodded once and let me go. The paper is in the open access archive of the Institute now. Anyone can read it. It is filed under its official project title, which is a long administrative description of its subject matter. Nobody would find it by accident. You would have to be looking for it or looking for something near it. Some people will look. On the last day of the semester, the group met once more in the archive room. Not for research, just to be in the place where we had done the work before. The semester ended and we each moved forward into whatever came next. Dari brought food. Hicks ate most of it. I brought a summary document of every significant finding color-coded by category because the semester was ending, and my habits were not Yina brought her coffee. She sat in her corner. Her cup was warm. She had built the mechanism that kept it warm, and she carried it with her, and it did not require anyone else's infrastructure. I looked at her across the table. I thought a species that the model could not find the upper boundary for. A species whose ambassador read those results and agreed they were accurate, and signed the order anyway. A species that showed up at the docking stations year after year because they wanted to help, even not knowing the reason for the door being closed, even knowing there was a reason they were not being given. Dangerous. Yes, the simulation says yes. Also that. The cup warm in her hands. The heating element she built herself. The cost she had not personally paid, but had arrived carrying anyway, the way people carry the weight of decisions made before them that shape the world they were born into. I do not have adequate categories for all of this. I think that is probably the point. I am going to need a much larger taxonomy